They say the Empire of Valdrath was built on the bones of 1,000 conquered kingdoms, and that is not a metaphor. The founding emperor literally mortared the stones of his throne room with the ground remains of defeated kings, so that every step toward power would be taken on top of the fallen. 300 years later, nothing had changed. The empire stretched across 4 continents and was held together not by loyalty, not by law, but by fear. Emperor Valdros Donvale had ruled for 31 years, and in those 31 years, there had been exactly 0 successful rebellions. 14 attempted ones, but none successful. Those 14 would become important later. But every empire, no matter how carefully built, carries a flaw in its foundation. For Valdrath, that flaw had silver-white hair, storm-gray eyes, and a very bad habit of surviving things that should have killed him. His name was Kale, and the empire had spent 6 years trying very hard to forget he existed. 6 years ago, Kale Donvale had been the second prince of Valdrath, overlooked, underestimated, and ultimately inconvenient. His father, Emperor Valdros, had needed a scapegoat for a failed military campaign in the northern provinces. Kale had been 17. The charges of treason had been spectacularly false. The exile had been real. They hadn't even bothered with a formal execution. They'd simply dumped him across the Ashwall border in the middle of winter with no coin, no food, and no identity papers. Just a boy, an iron ring, and the understanding that if he ever returned, the next order would be a kill on sight one. He returned anyway. It just took 6 years to be ready. The city of Denvara was the first stop on what Kale privately called his, absolutely not a revenge plan. It was the 3rd largest city in the empire, home to 3 things he needed: information, money, and a contact whose name had been passed to him by a dying insurgent in a salt mine tavern 2 provinces over. The contact's name was Saris Vane. The insurgent had described her as, quote, the most dangerous person in Denvara who isn't technically trying to overthrow the government. Quote, he found Saris exactly where the dying insurgent had said she'd be, at the back corner table of an underground fighting ring beneath a fish market. She was not fighting. She was doing something more dangerous. She was watching, cataloging, and betting with methodical precision on fighters she'd clearly studied for weeks. She looked up the moment he walked in, which meant she'd known he was coming. You're the exiled prince, she said, before he'd sat down. Not a question. I'm a dockworker looking for work, he said. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table to him. It was a wanted poster, 6 years old, faded, but unmistakably his face. Next lie, she said pleasantly. He sat down. Saris Vane, he quickly learned, was a former Imperial intelligence operative who had gone rogue 4 years ago when she discovered that a particular operation she'd run, an assassination of a provincial governor she believed was corrupt, had actually been ordered because that governor had been about to expose the emperor's decade-long practice of skimming tribute money from the border territories to fund a secret private army. She'd been used. She had opinions about that. What do you actually want? He asked her that first night. It was the most important question, and he needed to know before he told her a single true thing about himself. She didn't hesitate. I want the machine to break, she said. I don't care who breaks it or how. I just want to watch it come apart. He thought about that for a long moment. I can work with that, he said. Over the next 3 weeks, they exchanged information like traders at a market, carefully, testing the quality of each item before committing to the transaction. Kale knew things about the imperial court's internal structure, the real lines of power behind the ceremonial ones. Saris knew the current state of every resistance cell, criminal network, and disaffected noble house across the empire's western half. Together, the picture they assembled was both more hopeful and more terrifying than either had imagined. The most critical piece of information Kale carried was something he'd never told anyone, not even the insurgent who'd sent him to Saris. Before his exile, as a young prince with limited power but unrestricted access to the palace library, he had found something. Buried in 60-year-old administrative records, cross-referenced across 4 separate ledger systems, was evidence of a foundational crime. Not just corruption, but a specifically structured one that, under the empire's own ancient legal codes, constituted automatic grounds for the dissolution of imperial authority. The crime was this: the original Donvale Compact, the legal instrument by which the first emperor had been granted imperial authority by the Council of Free Lords 3 centuries ago, contained a specific clause. If the imperial line ever demonstrated a willful pattern of territorial theft from the sovereign territories of recognized lordships, those lordships had the legal right to invoke the compact's dissolution clause. And Emperor Valdros had been doing exactly that, stealing tribute from border territories for a decade. In writing, you're saying the emperor has been legally dissolving his own authority for 10 years and doesn't know it, Saris said. Because no one's looked at the original compact in a century. The compact is the only document that matters, Kale said. Get enough of the affected lords to invoke it simultaneously, and his army can't stop it, because the army's chain of command is legally bound by the compact too. The whole thing unravels at once. The silence in the room was the sound of a plan being born. But they had 3 problems. Problem 1. To make the legal case stick, they needed the original physical compact, not a copy, the actual signed original, which was kept in the imperial archive beneath the palace itself. Problem 2. They needed at minimum 12 of the 22 affected lords' signatures on a formal invocation document, and those lords were scattered across 4 continents and had every reason to be terrified. Problem 3. Someone in the capital had to buy them enough time to make this happen. And they had exactly nobody in the capital. We need people, Sarah said. And not just bodies, we need the right kinds of people for the right kinds of problems. She pulled out a different kind of list from her code, not intelligence reports this time, but names. Names she'd been collecting for 4 years, the way someone who expects to one day need them very badly collects names. Kale looked at the list. Then he looked at her. You've been planning something like this for a while, he said. I've been planning something exactly like this for a while, she replied. I just needed a reason the lords would actually believe. The first name on Saras's list was Orrin Blackthorne, a disgraced former Imperial Army commander who had been court-martialed and stripped of rank 3 years ago for refusing a direct order to burn a civilian settlement in a border province. The order had come from Emperor Valdros himself. Orrin had stood in front of his men, received the order in writing, read it aloud, folded it carefully, and then used it to light his pipe. He'd handed himself in for court-martial the following morning. Kale and Saras found him in the frontier town of Rassel's Crossing, doing odd jobs and refusing to talk about the capital. When Saras laid out their plan in broad terms, his only response for a full minute was continued whittling. Then he said, if you're asking me to commit treason, the answer is no. He paused. If you're asking me to enforce the actual law of the Empire against someone who's been breaking it for a decade, that's a different conversation. He put down the whittling. What do you need? The second name was Lee Elarin, a former scholar of the Imperial Academy of Letters who had been expelled for publishing an unauthorized academic paper arguing that the Dawnvale Compact was still legally active and had never been formally superseded. The paper had been declared seditious literature. Lee had been lucky to escape with expulsion rather than imprisonment. They were currently working as a private tutor in the city of Miraval, teaching the children of merchants and pretending to have forgotten everything they knew about imperial law. When they contacted Lee through a carefully worded letter, the response came back within 2 days, a single sentence. If you have the original compact, I'll build you a case so airtight the gods themselves couldn't rule against it. If you don't have it yet, I'll help you get it. Attached was a 12-page technical memo on the compact's chain of custody over 3 centuries and precisely which shelf in the Imperial Archive it would be stored on. Lee had clearly not stopped thinking about this. The third name was one Kale recognized, and not pleasantly. Fen Darrow had once been the most effective insurgent handler the Empire had produced. He'd infiltrated and dismantled 7 resistance cells over 10 years working for Imperial intelligence, but then had inexplicably switched sides, vanishing from the Imperial payroll and resurfacing 2 years later as one of the most effective support operators for the same kinds of cells he'd once destroyed. No one fully understood why. Saras said the reason didn't matter. Kale said it absolutely did. They met Fen in a tavern near the docks. He bought them drinks before they'd said a word, which was unsettling. Over the course of 2 hours, he was charming, warm, and completely honest about his history on both sides. I worked for the Empire because I believed it could be reformed from inside, he said. Then I watched them give the order to burn Kella's province, and I stopped believing that. He sipped his drink. What's your plan for the morning after? That's the part most people forget. The morning after, Kale said carefully, is not my problem alone to solve. It was the right answer. He could see it register in Fen's dark eyes. Fen had spent years watching people come in with grand plans to tear things down and no idea what to build instead, and every time, the vacuum had been filled by something just as bad or worse. The question wasn't a challenge. It was a test. And Kale's answer, that rebuilding would require more than one person's vision, was the only kind of answer Fen trusted. 4 people. A disgraced prince, a rogue intelligence operative, a stripped-rank soldier, an expelled scholar, and a man who'd been on both sides and trusted neither. Plus Fen, who made 5. It was, by any reasonable military or political analysis, laughably inadequate. But each of them had something the others didn't. Kale had the legal knowledge and the bloodline. Saras had the intelligence network. Orrin had the loyalty of dozens of former soldiers scattered across the Empire. Lee had the legal architecture. And Fen knew where every body was buried, figuratively and sometimes literally. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1. Reach the affected noble lords and plant the seeds of the invocation. Phase 2. Retrieve the original compact from the Imperial Archive. Phase 3. Return to the capital, invoke the dissolution, and survive long enough for it to matter. Phase 3 was, everyone agreed, the part most likely to kill them all. They spent 2 days enthusiastically planning Phase 1 and trying not to think about Phase 3. Phase 1 required elegance rather than force. Walking up to a duke or duchess and saying, please join our potentially treasonous coalition, was the kind of approach that ended with your head on a pike. What Saras had devised instead was a package. A carefully curated dossier of financial evidence showing each individual noble house exactly how much tribute money the emperor had stolen from them specifically, paired with a sealed letter from Cale Donvale bearing his iron ring's impression, the only surviving proof of his identity. Then they waited to see who wrote back. 11 responses came back over the following 3 weeks. 10 were variations of, "I am frightened, interested, and will wait to see which way this falls before committing." One response was different. It came from Duchess Karen Holt of the West March territories, arguably the most powerful of the affected lords, and the one the emperor feared most. Her response was 4 words, written in a sharp, decisive hand: when and where. Holt. Duchess Karen Holt received them in the great hall of her estate in the West March, sitting at the head of an enormous table with a glass of dark wine and the posture of someone who has already decided to do something and is merely assessing how the other party is going to conduct themselves. "Sit," she said, without preamble. "Tell me why I should trust a man I've only ever known as a wanted poster." Cale sat. "Because," he said, "I'm the only person who knows what's in those ledgers, and I'm the only person who can build the coalition you'd need to invoke the compact. Without me, you have grievances. With me, you have a case." Karen studied him for a long moment. Then she looked at Saris. Then at Oren. Then back at Cale. "I knew your mother," she said finally. This was unexpected. She was smarter than your father by a considerable distance. She would have dismantled him herself if she'd lived. A pause. "You have her eyes." She set down her wine glass. "What do you need from me?" What they needed from her was 2 things. The formal mobilization of her network of noble contacts, the ones who'd sent those cautious, wait-and-see letters, and her considerable financial resources to fund the operation. She gave them both, with one condition. "I want a seat at the table when you plan whatever comes after," she said. "Not a courtesy seat. A real one. I am not investing in the replacement of one unilateral ruler with another." Cale agreed without hesitation. It was, he reflected, the most reasonable thing anyone had said to him in 6 years. Back in the capital, things were moving in ways that complicated all of this. Emperor Valdros Donvale was not, contrary to what his exiled son sometimes needed to believe, a stupid man. He was ruthless, paranoid, and had the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 30 years staying alive at the top of the most dangerous court in the known world. And for the past month, his intelligence apparatus had been picking up whispers, faint, disconnected whispers, that something was organizing itself in the outer territories. He summoned Commander Risht, head of his personal security apparatus and one of perhaps 4 people in the empire the emperor genuinely trusted, in the specific sense that he trusted them to be too afraid and too self-interested to betray him. "Something is moving in the provinces," the emperor said. "I want to know what before it reaches the capital. I want agents in every territory." Risht, whose hollow cheeks and precise movements suggested a man who slept perhaps 4 hours on a good night, said simply, "Already dispatched, Your Majesty." There was a third player in the capital whose role in all of this had not yet become clear, even to herself. Mirat Thesson was the emperor's chief advisor, his most trusted court figure for the past 12 years, architect of half his most effective policies and all of his least defensible ones. She knew about the tribute theft because she had helped design the ledger system that concealed it. She also knew things about the emperor that no one else in the court knew. And she had been watching the whispers from the provinces with an expression that, to anyone who knew how to read her, looked very much like anticipation. What Mirat Thesson had been doing for the past 2 years, very quietly, in the tiny spaces between her official duties, using methods that left no record an intelligence operative would know to look for, was documenting everything. Every illegal order, every falsified record, every crime committed in the name of the imperial administration that she had been close enough to witness. She had not decided yet what to do with this documentation. She was waiting, as she often did, for the precisely right moment. She had a feeling that moment was getting very close. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, First Prince Dane Donvale, Cale's elder brother, the legitimate heir, was performing his function with extraordinary competence. That function, as designed by his father, was to look regal, make the right speeches, and stay completely out of the way of any actual decision-making. Dane had spent 25 years excelling at this. He was handsome, polished, and utterly aware that he held his position through his father's continued goodwill and nothing else. He was also, beneath the careful grooming, terrified. Dane Donvale had known for 6 years that his brother's exile was unjust. He had known, with the particular shame of someone who had said nothing and done nothing, that he could have spoken and had chosen not to. Not because he was cruel. Dane was not, by nature, a cruel person, but because he had correctly understood that speaking would not have saved Cale and would certainly have destroyed himself. He had been 19. He had made the calculation. He had lived with it ever since. Phase 2 was the operation that Cale privately believed would either make the whole plan work or end it catastrophically. Breaking into the Imperial Archive, which sat beneath 3 levels of the palace's most heavily guarded sub-levels, was not, technically, something any of them knew how to do. This was where Saris's intelligence network, Fenn's extensive knowledge of Imperial security protocols from his time as an agent, and one very specific piece of information Lee had in their 12-page technical memo became critical. Lee's critical piece of information was this: the Imperial Archive had a second access point. Not a secret door or hidden passage in the dramatic sense, but a mundane one, The archive was also connected to the Imperial University's extended Rare Collections Library through a cataloging tunnel, built 80 years ago when the two institutions had been briefly and disastrously merged. That merger had been dissolved, but no one had ever officially sealed the tunnel because it wasn't officially in the palace's security records. Because it also wasn't officially in the university's records. Because the monk who built it had died before filing the paperwork. The plan required 3 people in the capital: Li, to navigate the archive once inside and find the compact; Fen, who knew the security rotation patterns of Imperial intelligence agents from his years working among them; and Kale, who needed to go himself because he was the only one who had actually held and read the original ledgers that corroborated the compact's legal application. If they found something they needed to cross-reference, only he would know what he was looking at. Saris and Oren would remain outside as extraction support and, if necessary, very loud distractions. The Imperial University's Rare Collections Library was locked at night with 3 Imperial seals, which was very impressive for a building whose kitchen entrance around the back was secured with a lock that Fen opened in 11 seconds with a bent piece of wire and a patience that suggested he'd done this particular type of thing many times. Former Imperial agent, he explained cheerfully to Kale's expression of impressed disbelief, and then they were inside and descending. The cataloging tunnel was exactly where Li had said it would be, behind a false shelf in the deepest basement of the Rare Collections Library. It was approximately 4 feet tall, pitch black, smelled strongly of old stone and older paper, and extended in a straight line for about 60 meters. Kale, who was the tallest of the 3, discovered all of this immediately and in the worst possible order. Fen handed him a small oil lamp and the courtesy of not laughing for several seconds. The tunnel opened, as promised, into the edge of the Imperial Archive. And the Imperial Archive was unlike anything any of them had expected, even Li, who had spent years reading about it. It was enormous. Not large room enormous, but cathedral enormous, carved directly from the living rock beneath the palace, with shelves cut into the stone walls rising 50 feet up to a vaulted ceiling, connected by narrow iron walkways bolted into the rock face. The entire thing was lit by a blue-white luminescence emanating from the stones themselves, some kind of old preservation enchantment. "Oh," said Li, in the voice of someone who had studied a thing for years and still was not fully prepared for its reality. Then their scholar's instincts kicked in hard, and they pushed past Kale with their satchel flying and began scanning the carved stone index markers on the nearest shelves with the speed and focus of someone who had essentially been waiting their entire career for this moment. 300 years of administrative records, they breathed. Everything that's ever been filed. Kale, this is everything. Where's the compact? Kale reminded them, as gently as urgency allows. Li pointed without looking up from their index scanning. Founding documents, Tier 1, Section A up there. They pointed to the highest walkway level, near the center of the archive. Kale looked up. Fen looked up. The walkway was approximately 40 feet above them, accessible by a narrow iron ladder bolted to the archive wall that looked like it had not been inspected since the archive was built. "Wonderful," said Fen, and started climbing. The Dawnvale compact was in a sealed glass and iron case bolted directly to the stone wall of Tier 1, Section A, because of course the founding document of the Empire couldn't just sit on a shelf like a normal scroll. The case was locked, with a very complex lock. Kale looked at Fen. Fen looked at the lock. 11 seconds was optimistic, Fen said, pulling out his tools again. "This is more of a 4-minute lock. We have," Kale said, checking his mental clock against Fen's security rotation information, "approximately 7 minutes before the lower-level patrol comes back around." "Wonderful," said Fen again, and got to work. The lock opened in 3 minutes and 42 seconds, which Fen seemed mildly disappointed by, as if he'd been hoping to beat his own estimate. The case opened. The compact was, in person, simultaneously less and more impressive than Kale had imagined. A very large, very old, very fragile-looking scroll of thick parchment with multiple enormous wax seals in a rainbow of colors, each representing a different signatory lord from 3 centuries ago. At the bottom, alone and slightly apart from the others, was the first Dawnvale seal in deep crimson. Kale touched the edge of the scroll and felt something he couldn't name: history as a physical weight. They got out. Not without the patrol appearing 3 minutes early, which necessitated 17 tense minutes crouched inside a storage alcove while an archive guard who appeared to also be working on a creative writing project audibly narrated an adventure story to himself as he walked his rounds. This was not something Fen's security rotation information had anticipated. They all agreed afterward not to mention it. The important thing was that they got out, they got through the tunnel, and the compact was in Li's satchel, wrapped in 3 layers of oilskin. Outside, Saris had the extraction route ready, and also several questions about why it had taken 47 minutes instead of the planned 30. Kale said, there was a complication. Saris looked at Fen. Fen made a face that conveyed something. Saris decided not to pursue it. Oren, who had spent the entire operation sitting on a rooftop with his arms crossed, simply said, "Is the document intact?" "Good. Then can we leave this city before someone notices it's missing?" They were, in fact, out of the capital within 3 hours of the archive extraction, moving in a pre-arranged split, Fen and Li heading southeast by river barge with the compact, Saris going north to begin coordinating the noble network, Orin southwest to rally his network of former soldiers, and Kale alone heading due east toward a meeting that none of the others knew about yet. Because Kale had not told any of them about the Archivist. The Archivist was a name, or more accurately a title, that Kale had encountered in the old palace library as a teenager and had thought was merely historical. A keeper of certain kinds of knowledge that didn't fit neatly into official records. Custodian of testimonies, confessions, and informal evidence that powerful people had entrusted to someone outside the official system precisely because the official system was the threat. The position had existed, apparently, for as long as the Empire. Kale had spent 3 months of his exile tracking whether it still did. It still did. The current archivist lived in what could only be described as a library that had grown sentient and begun decorating itself. A structure somewhere between a tower, a cave, and a very ambitious storage solution, built into the side of a cliff face in the eastern mountains 3 days' travel from the nearest road. Kale had found it by following extremely specific directions left in a dead drop that a contact of Saris's contact had eventually produced after 3 weeks of careful asking. He stood before the door and knocked. The archivist opened the door before he'd finished knocking. This seemed to be less psychic ability and more that every approach to the structure was apparently visible through a system of cleverly angled polished metal mirrors. They looked at Kale with their milky pale eyes that tracked everything, said, "Second Prince of Valdrath. Older than I expected, but then you were late," and turned around and walked back into the structure without waiting for a response. Kale followed, because what else do you do? Inside, the structure was somehow both larger than it appeared from outside and more chaotic than should be possible without structural failure. Books grew from shelves like geological formations. Documents hung from strings in complex networks that the archivist navigated by memory without ever needing to look up. The blue flame in the staff orb brightened as they moved deeper in, providing light. "You want the Kelleran testimonies," the archivist said, without turning around. Kale stopped walking. He had not mentioned the Kelleran testimonies to anyone. "How do you know about the Kelleran testimonies?" Kale said carefully. The archivist paused at a junction of 3 document corridors. "Because I am the archivist," they said, as if this explained everything. Then, because it clearly didn't, 62 years ago, a man named Kelleran was the Emperor's personal treasurer. He was the one who first designed the tributary accounting system that your father later adapted for his theft. Before he died, he wrote everything down and sent it here. They resumed walking. He was hoping it would be useful eventually. The Kelleran testimonies were 62 years of personal records from the imperial treasurer who had built the tribute accounting system, including his specific instructions for how the system had been designed to enable plausible deniability theft, and a projection of exactly how much would have been taken from which territories by the time it had been running for a decade. Kale held the sealed container and understood that this was the thing that would make even the cautious lords sign. Not just evidence that they'd been robbed. Evidence of exactly how deliberately the robbery had been designed. "Why are you giving these to me?" he asked. The archivist considered this. "Because you asked the right question," they said. "Every person who found their way to me in the past 60 years asked, 'What can I use this for?' You asked, before anything else, whether the former treasurer's family had been informed of what he left behind. That is a different kind of question." Kale thought about this. "Were they?" he asked. The archivist smiled for what appeared to be the first time in some years. "No. Arranging that will be your first act is something worth being." He spent 2 days with the archivist, reading and copying what he needed, and learning things about the Empire's history that had been deliberately obscured from official records. How many of the 14 attempted rebellions had come close? What had happened to the people who'd led them afterward? Not the official story, but the real one. The patterns of how the imperial machine suppressed dissent. And one other thing. That the archivist had copies of correspondence between High Cleric Solvane and the Emperor that suggested the Imperial Church's official blessing of the monarchy was itself conditional on conditions the Emperor was currently violating. High Cleric Solvane was a name that landed in Kale's planning like a very large stone into a very calm pond. The Imperial Church commanded the spiritual loyalty of approximately 60% of the Empire's population. If the High Cleric could be persuaded, or pressured, to withdraw the Church's blessing from the Emperor, the psychological impact would be enormous. Not legally decisive, but politically devastating. People who might hesitate to defy an emperor might not hesitate to defy an emperor whose god had withdrawn endorsement. The archivist handed him the Solvane correspondence with the flat observation that the High Cleric has been uncomfortable with the current arrangement for 3 years and is looking for permission to act on that discomfort. Kale looked at the letters. They showed Solvane repeatedly flagging specific theological violations in the emperor's conduct, and Valdros dismissing each one with language that grew progressively more contemptuous. The last letter in the series, from Solvane, was a single paragraph that ended, "I am a patient man, your majesty, but God is not." Kale carefully added the copies to his pack. He left the archivist's library on the morning of the 3rd day. At the door, the archivist handed him one more thing, a small sealed letter. "Don't read this until you're in the capital," they said. "You'll know when." Kale took it. "What's in it?" he asked. A piece of information that will change how you see one of your allies, the archivist said. But you'll need everything else to be in place first, or the change in perspective will break the coalition instead of completing it. They closed the door. Kale stood in the mountain mist and felt the universe's sense of humor acutely. Back in the capital, things were escalating. Commander Reist's agents had begun narrowing in on the safe house network Saris had been building, which meant that either someone had been careless or, and this was the more troubling option Saris favored, someone within the network had been turned. She sent a single coded message to the rest of the group. Phase 3 window is moving up. We have weeks, not months. Accelerate everything. Oren, in the southwestern territories, had found his old soldiers more receptive than he dared hope. Many of them had been court-martialed for similar offenses, refusing orders that crossed moral lines, or had resigned quietly after watching what the Empire had become. He had not asked them to fight. He had asked them to position themselves, to be present, visible, in key territories when the legal invocation happened, so that any Imperial military response would face the question of whether to fire on their former commanders. 73 former officers agreed to position. It was, in Oren's professional assessment, enough. Lee, traveling with Fen and the Compact, had not been idle. On the river barge, they had spent 3 days drafting the formal invocation document, the specific legal instrument that would be signed by the noble lords and presented simultaneously with the Compact to initiate the dissolution process. It was, Fen told them after reading it, the most dense and terrifying document he had ever seen in terms of its implications, while being written in the driest possible academic legal language. He meant this as a compliment. Lee received it as such. Kale reassembled with the group in the safe house in the town of Veldis, 2 weeks' travel from the capital, where Duchess Holt had arranged cover through a merchant contact. They had the Compact, the Kelleran testimonies, the Solvane correspondence, the invocation document, a coalition of 73 positioned former officers, and the beginning of a noble network that was cautiously moving toward commitment. What they needed to do next was coordinate the approach to High Cleric Solvane, and figure out how to get back into the capital. The question of High Cleric Solvane was a delicate one. Approaching him directly was too dangerous. He was technically within the Emperor's household. Sending a message through the church's internal network was too likely to be intercepted. What Fen proposed instead was elegant in its indirectness. Let Solvane come to them. Specifically, let him come to an apparently routine confession session with a traveling cleric, one of his own, who happened to be part of the network of people Fen had cultivated over years. A cleric who could pass him a sealed package without drawing attention. The package contained a copy of the Solvane correspondence from the archivist, a copy of the Compact's dissolution clause, and a single-page letter from Kale. Written in plain language, without title or formality. You have already decided this emperor no longer has God's blessing. I am giving you the legal mechanism to say so. We have 12 days. After that, the window closes and whatever happens without you will be worse than what can happen with you. It was, Saris noted, possibly the most direct piece of communication she'd seen Kale produce. He said the High Cleric struck him as someone who responded better to honesty than eloquence. The response came 3 days later. Not a letter. Solvane sent a messenger with a verbal message only, nothing written, who arrived at the merchant cover location in Veldis at midnight, said 16 words, and left. The High Cleric will be at the Grand Temple in the capital on the day of the Festival of Remembrance. He will know what to do. The Festival of Remembrance was 11 days away. Kale looked at Saris. Saris looked at Kale. Phase 3, she said. Phase 3 was returning to the capital with the Compact and the invocation document, getting 12 noble lords to sign simultaneously, most of whom were not physically present and would need to sign through representatives, presenting the invocation to the Council of Legacy Lords that still technically existed as the Compact's designated receiving body, and surviving whatever the Emperor did in the window between presentation and the invocation taking legal effect. Simple. Obviously simple. The group spent the next 2 days in what Oren described as productive panic. The problem of getting 12 noble representatives into the capital simultaneously and discreetly was solved by Duchess Holt with characteristic directness. She announced a regional economic summit, a legitimately held gathering that she had standing authority to call under imperial charter, for the day before the Festival of Remembrance. This gave 12 noble representatives a completely legal reason to all be in the capital simultaneously. It was, she wrote to Kale in a letter that radiated satisfaction, remarkable how useful old bureaucratic tools are when you actually bother to read them. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, Mira Thesson had made a decision. She had been waiting for the right moment for 2 years, and watching the province whispers grow into something structured and purposeful over the past months had convinced her that the moment was arriving. She did something that by any rational assessment was extraordinarily dangerous. She sought a private meeting with Commander Richt. Not to betray the operation, but to make Richt an offer that would only make sense if he was, himself, not as committed to the current regime as he appeared. What Mira said to Richt, in the most careful possible language, was this: that she was aware of certain activities in the outer provinces. That she had, for her own reasons, chosen not to bring them to the Emperor's immediate attention. That she was curious whether Commander Richt had similar discretion regarding similar information. And that if he did, she might have a proposal that served his interests considerably better than the current trajectory of events. Richt said absolutely nothing for 45 seconds. Then he said, "I'll hear it." What Mira knew, because she knew everything that happened in the Emperor's court and had for 12 years, was that Richt had a reason to want the current regime to change. 4 years ago, his daughter had been sentenced to hard labor in a salt mine because she'd been caught spreading a pamphlet critical of the Emperor. The sentence had been Valdros's personal order. Richt had stood in the throne room, received the sentence, saluted, and gone back to work. He had never once let it show. Mira had watched him not let it show for 4 years, which was a kind of admiration she rarely extended to anyone. What Mira proposed to Richt was both simple and extraordinary. That when the legal invocation happened, rather than mobilizing the Imperial Guard to suppress it, he delay. Create procedural complexity. Require authorizations at each level of the chain of command. Let the legal process run its course before military response could be organized. He didn't need to fight against the Emperor. He just needed to slow the machine. The machine he knew better than anyone. He looked at her for a long time. "How long would you need?" he said. 6 hours, she said. "After that, it won't matter." He agreed. Not because he trusted Mira Thesson. A man in Richt's position trusted very few people, and Mira was, by nature, not easily trustworthy. But because the alternative was the current trajectory continuing, and the current trajectory ended somewhere he was not willing to go. "If this fails," he said, "we're both dead." "Yes," she said calmly. "But if it succeeds, your daughter comes home." She said it not as a manipulation but as a statement of fact. He nodded once and they went their separate ways in the palace corridor, and did not speak to each other again until the day. The group entered the capital in 3 waves over the 2 days before the festival, using the economic summit as cover like everyone else. Duchess Holt arrived first, with pomp and ceremony and a delegation that was simultaneously legitimate attendees of the summit and a cover for the noble representatives who would need to sign the invocation. Lee arrived with the documents, tucked inside a delegate's luggage. Fen arrived through a route that nobody was going to ask him about. Oren arrived last, looking like a traveling merchant and radiating the very convincing energy of someone who had absolutely nothing on his back under that merchant's coat. Kale and Saris entered the capital together on the day before the festival, through a route Saris had used during her intelligence operative years. It involved a river barge, a section of the city's old drainage infrastructure that predated the current sewer system, and a safe house 2 streets from the Grand Temple district that had been maintained by Saris's network for 3 years without ever being used, because Saris had always intended it for exactly this purpose. She was, as Kale had come to understand, a person who planned multiple contingencies before the initial contingency was even finalized. The night before the festival, the full group convened in the safe house for the last time before execution. Kale laid out the sequence. At the 10th bell, mid-morning during the festival ceremonies, the noble representatives in the Economic Summit Hall would sign the invocation simultaneously, coordinated by Duchess Holt. The signed invocation and the original compact would then be presented to the 5 surviving members of the Council of Legacy Lords, who still technically met monthly for a ceremonial lunch that no one had thought to abolish. They would receive it. Legal process would begin. Simultaneously, and this was the part that required everything to move on precise schedule, High Cleric Solvane would publicly withdraw the church's blessing from the Emperor during the festival ceremony at the Grand Temple, before an audience of several thousand people and, critically, before news of the legal invocation could be suppressed. The dual announcement, legal dissolution and ecclesiastical withdrawal, would happen within the same hour. The Empire's population would know before the Emperor's forces could formulate a response. What happens when the Emperor finds out? Oren asked, because someone had to. He will move to suppress immediately, Kale said. He'll order the guard to arrest everyone involved. He looked at them each in turn. Commander Richt will receive those orders. He will route them through the verification protocol, which requires counter-signature from the Lord Marshal, who is currently traveling in 3 days message distance away. This creates a 6-hour window. And in 6 hours? Fen said. In 6 hours, the invocation has legal force and the Emperor is legally required to stand before the council. A pause. Whether he does or not is a different question. Kale remembered the sealed letter from the archivist then. He'd been carrying it against his chest for weeks. The instruction had been, when everything is in place. Everything was in place. He opened it. He read it again. Then he sat very still for about 30 seconds, which was long enough for Saris to notice and say, "What is it?" He folded the letter. "Something I need to deal with," he said, separately, and before morning. He stood up and looked at his team. "Trust me until morning. Can you do that?" No one asked what was in the letter. They trusted him until morning. What the letter contained was this. Mira Thesson, the Emperor's chief advisor, was not an imperial loyalist who had become a quiet dissident. She was, and had been for 12 years, an agent placed by the original coalition of noble houses who had first begun organizing against Valdros a decade ago, before the operation was shut down when its leaders were arrested. She had buried herself so deep in the imperial administration that she'd outlasted the coalition that placed her. She had been waiting for someone to reconstitute the operation. She knew everything about their plan. And she had been protecting them from inside the palace for months. The information changed how he had to approach the morning. Because Mirathesan, who had spent 12 years in the Emperor's court, knew something about the Emperor that Kale and his team didn't. Emperor Valdros had a second option that none of them had planned for. If faced with legal dissolution, he could invoke an emergency provision written into the old imperial code that allowed an emperor to nullify any legal action against the crown by submitting to personal judgment by the council. And he had been preparing for exactly this possibility for years. He had a prepared defense. A very good one. He went to see his brother. This was the part that, if it went wrong, would end everything in the worst way. But the letter had been clear. Prince Dane Donvale had been quietly approached by Mirathesan 6 months ago and had been briefed on the broad outlines of the operation. He had not been told Kale was involved. He had agreed to cooperate on the condition that whatever happened, the transition of power be handled in a way that didn't require a civil war. Dane Donvale, it turned out, was not his father's son in any of the ways that mattered. "You're alive," Dane said. "I've been trying to be," Kale said. The brothers looked at each other in a palace corridor at 3 in the morning, separated by 6 years of enforced absence and the enormous complicated fact of their shared history. Dane had the look of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was trying to determine whether it was safe to put it down. Kale had the look of someone who had rehearsed this meeting many times and was finding the reality considerably more complicated than the rehearsal. "Are you here to tell me you hate me?" Dane asked. It was the question of someone who had asked it of himself many times. "No," Kale said. "I'm here because you're the only person in this palace who has the authority to do what I'm about to ask you to do, and also because," he paused. "Because you should know what's happening before it happens. You deserve that." Dane let him inside. They talked for 2 hours. By the end, Dane looked not lighter exactly, but more like someone who had decided what they were going to be, and was relieved to finally know. The morning of the Festival of Remembrance arrived the way important mornings do. Impossibly ordinary on the surface, with the capital city bright and noisy and full of citizens genuinely celebrating a religious holiday, while beneath that ordinary surface, 12 separate contingencies were balanced against each other like a tower of cards in a slight breeze. Kale stood in the safe house and looked out the window at the festival crowds and felt, for the first time since exile, something he'd forgotten he was allowed to feel. Ready. At the 9th bell, the noble representatives gathered in the Economic Summit Hall under Duchess Holt's chairmanship. 12 lords and their representatives, seated at a long table with the invocation document before them and Lee Ellerin at the far end, ready to authenticate the signing in real time with their precise knowledge of the legal requirements. Each representative had received their private briefing. Each had the specific financial evidence of what had been stolen from their particular house. Each had made their decision before walking into that room. At the 10th bell, as planned, High Cleric Solvane stood before thousands of worshippers in the Grand Temple and delivered a sermon that began as a standard festival address and then, at its center, did something that had not been done in the history of the empire. He formally withdrew the Imperial Church's endorsement of Emperor Valdros Donvale. Not as a revolutionary act. As a theological one. He cited specific chapter and verse. He named specific violations. He was calm, methodical, and completely devastating. 3,000 people in the Grand Temple heard it live. In the Imperial Palace, the news reached Emperor Valdros via 4 different sources in the space of about 11 minutes, which suggested that his intelligence network was working correctly even if nothing else was. He absorbed the first report with imperial control. He absorbed the second with his jaw tightening. The third broke through his composure. The fourth, which included a preliminary copy of the invocation document, turned his face the specific color of a man who has spent 30 years being terrified of exactly this moment and is now watching it arrive anyway. "Mobilize the guard," he said. "Arrest everyone associated with this immediately." Now, the order went to Commander Richt. Commander Richt received it, acknowledged it, saluted, and walked with precise economical steps to his office where he initiated the mobilization protocol. The mobilization protocol required counter-signature from the Lord Marshal. Commander Richt sent a standard courier with the counter-signature request. A standard courier rather than the emergency line. The standard courier moved at standard courier speed. The 6-hour window opened. Kale moved the moment word came from Lee that the invocation was signed. He was not alone. He had Saris and Orin with him, because what he was about to do required witnesses of a specific kind. He was going to the meeting of the Council of Legacy Lords. The 5 elderly council members who convened monthly for their ceremonial lunch, who had no idea that today, their lunch was also the most historically significant meeting of their institution in 300 years. He had the compact. He had the invocation. He had the legal right to present it. And he had Dane. Prince Dane Donvale was already at the council chambers when Kale arrived. He had gotten there first, using his legitimate access as first prince, and had sat down with the 5 bewildered council members over their lunch and explained, with the careful precision he'd spent a lifetime developing, that something extraordinary was about to happen and that they needed to hear it properly, with their full authority as the receiving body of the compact, assembled and recognized. 2 of the 5 had initially resisted. Dane had pointed to the specific clause of the council charter. They had stopped resisting. When Kale walked in with Saris, Oren, and the compact, the Council of Legacy Lords looked at him the way people look at something they have read about extensively in historical documents and assumed was purely theoretical. The eldest council member, a woman of at least 80, who had been on the council longer than the emperor had been on the throne, looked at the compact, looked at Kale, looked at the iron ring on his thumb, and said, "Second Prince." Not a question, not a title, simply recognition. Council member, Kale said. He placed the compact and the invocation on the table. The eldest council member picked up the compact. She handled it with the practiced care of someone who had spent a lifetime near old documents. She read the dissolution clause. She read the invocation. She read Lee's certification of the signatures. She set the documents down and looked at the other 4 council members, who had also been reading. "Is this legally sound?" she asked, looking directly at Lee, who had entered behind Kale. "Yes," Lee said, "under the original language of the compact, without modification or amendment." Another pause. "Then the council receives it," she said, "and it is entered into record." The document was entered into record at 11:43 in the morning. The 6-hour window had 4 hours and 17 minutes remaining. Word moved through the capital, not as a controlled announcement, but as the organic spread of something witnessed by too many people to contain. The Grand Temple had had 3,000 witnesses. The Economic Summit Hall had 12 noble representatives now freely talking to their delegations. The council chambers had staff, who had administrative colleagues, who had families. By midday, the capital knew. Emperor Valdros Donvale, when he fully understood that the 6-hour window was not an administrative accident but a deliberate internal sabotage, did the thing that years of power had trained him to do. He went looking for who to blame, rather than how to fix it. He called for Risht. Then he called for Mira. Then he called for his personal legal counsel. Then he called for all of them simultaneously, which meant none of them arrived at the right time. The emperor was running a machine designed for absolute control, and someone had removed a critical gear, and the machine was grinding. Mira Thesson walked into his war room as if she had been summoned, not cornered. She stood before the emperor with the same composed, unblinking serenity she had maintained for 12 years, and waited for him to speak. "Did you know?" he said. It was the most dangerous question in the room. "Your Majesty," she said, "I have served this court faithfully for 12 years. Every word of that sentence was true. None of it was the answer he'd asked for. He understood, in that moment, who he was looking at. "How long?" he asked. 12 years, she said, and stopped pretending. He called for the guard. The guard commander was occupied with bureaucratic complexities. His personal attendants went running. Mira, unmoved, said, "The document has already been entered into the council record. You can arrest me, but you cannot undo that." She tilted her head slightly. "You have a legal option remaining. You can submit yourself to the council's judgment under the emergency provision." He stared at her. "Why would I do that?" "Because," she said, "your son asked me to tell you that if you submit, he will argue for internal exile rather than execution. That option closes in 3 hours. He had not been informed about his son. Not about Dane's role in what had happened, not about Dane's message. The emperor looked at the woman who had spent 12 years in his court, who had helped him build his administration, who had served with apparent loyalty through 2 wars and a dozen crises, and he looked at the clock on the wall. 30 years of absolute power, and it came down to a legal document and a 3-hour window. He was a ruthless man, but he was also an intelligent one. He knew when a position had become indefensible. He submitted, not gracefully, there is no graceful way to do what he did. But he submitted, and he came before the Council of Legacy Lords at the 3rd hour, and he stood in that wood-paneled room that had been built for ceremonial lunches and faced 5 elderly council members plus a council-appointed legal observer who happened to be Lee Elarin, and he was not the emperor in that room. He was simply a man who had done specific things over a specific period of time, and there was evidence, and the council had the authority to act on it. The process took 4 hours. By the end, under the specific provisions of the Compact's dissolution clause, Valdros Donvale was formally stripped of imperial authority. He was not executed. He was exiled to the Eastern Territories under supervision, with a pension calculated with dry precision to be sufficient and no more. Dane, who had argued for this outcome and who would spend years wondering whether he'd made the right call, stood in the corridor outside the council chamber and did not let himself feel any of it until it was over. Then he sat down on a bench in the corridor and put his head in his hands for approximately 4 minutes. Kale found him there. He sat down on the bench beside his brother and said nothing for a while. The sounds of the festival outside had changed. Less carefree now, more uncertain, but not panicked. The capital was processing something it didn't quite have the words for yet. "Is it done?" Dane asked. "The legal part," Kale said. "The rest of it is just starting." Dane lifted his head. "What rest?" "Rebuilding," Kale said, "which is harder than breaking. But we have people who know how to think about it." The transition period began with a series of emergency meetings that collectively lasted about 3 days straight, which suited no one's physical needs but was apparently what dismantling an empire and rebuilding it as something less terrible required. Duchess Holt emerged as the primary architect of the interim structure. No one was surprised. with Mirathesan contributing institutional knowledge with the particular thoroughness of someone who had been cataloging everything for 12 years precisely for this purpose. Kale attended the meetings. He did not lead them. This was deliberate. Darrow's question from their first meeting, "What's your plan for the morning after?" turned out to be the most important question asked in the entire operation. Because the morning after arrived, and it was complicated, and it was messy, and there were 14 provincial governors who weren't sure if they still had authority, and an imperial army that needed a clear chain of command and didn't currently have one, and about 900 administrative functions that needed to keep running regardless of who was nominally in charge of the empire. Fenn, who had asked the question, was now helping answer it. Orrin Blackthorne convened a meeting of the 73 positioned former officers and delivered one of the cleaner communications of the entire transition. The imperial army was not dissolved. It was formally transferred to council authority, pending a full structural review. Its commanders were expected to maintain order in their territories, avoid political activity, and stand by for further instruction. The instruction he was most proud of, standing orders for the burning of civilian settlements, were retroactively revoked, and any future such order should be considered automatically invalid and immediately refused. He filed this as Item 1. Lee Ellerin spent the week of the transition in a state of professional ecstasy that bordered on the alarming, because the legal reconstruction of the empire's administrative code from first principles, with the actual compact as the foundation document rather than centuries of overlay additions that had gradually obscured it, was, apparently, their exact dream project. They worked for days with minimal sleep, producing legal framework documents with the focused joy of someone who has spent their career being told their expertise was seditious and is now being asked to apply it as foundational policy. Saris checked on them periodically to make sure they were eating. High Cleric Solvain's public withdrawal of the church's blessing had done something unexpected and somewhat chaotic. It had prompted about a third of the church's provincial clergy to simultaneously demand clarification about whether the same theological principles that had been cited also applied to certain local governance structures that had been using the church's endorsement as a blanket protection for rather a lot of bad behavior. Solvain had not anticipated this downstream effect, but he had the intellectual honesty to address it directly rather than walk it back. He issued a general clarification. It was thorough and took a week to write. It was also theologically correct. Commander Riecht was formally arrested on the 5th day of the transition. Because the process required him to be arrested, he had technically violated his chain of command, regardless of the moral rightness of the violation. He had known this would happen. He submitted to arrest with the same precise, economical calm he brought to everything. He was held comfortably, interviewed extensively, and released within 48 hours when Mirathesan's documentation of his record was entered into consideration alongside the record of why his chain of command had warranted violation. His file was eventually marked, "Service above institutional obligation." He retired. 2 weeks after the Festival of Remembrance, Cale Donvale sat in a small garden in the capital, not the Palace Gardens, a public garden in the Merchant District, and tried to work out what came next for him specifically. He had spent 6 years focused entirely on the operation that had just concluded. The absence of that focus felt like a physical thing. He had the iron ring on his thumb and a country that didn't quite know what to do with him and a brother who was now technically the head of a transitional council and kept sending him formal meeting requests that he kept accepting and then sitting in as a participant rather than a driver. Saris found him there because she found everything, eventually. She sat beside him on the bench without invitation or announcement, watched the Merchant District pedestrians for a while, and then said, "You're thinking about the fact that you don't know what to do now." "I'm thinking about Kellerin's family," he said. She looked sideways at him. "You're thinking about that too," he amended. "But also the other thing." A silence. "What did the archivist say about it?" she asked. He hadn't told anyone about the letter from the archivist, but he wasn't surprised she'd worked out there was one. "They said informing Kellerin's family would be my first act as something worth being." "Then do that first," she said. "And then we figure out the rest." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "Fenn asked me to help him build an actual intelligence infrastructure," she said. "Not a loyalty to the throne structure. An accountability one, where the intelligence function serves the law rather than the sovereign." She paused. "It's a harder thing to build than to imagine." "I thought I'd try." He nodded. It made sense. It was exactly the thing she'd be good at and miserable without. "Good," he said. He found the Kellerin family 6 days later. An old letter of address from the archivist's documentation led him to a provincial town 3 days from the capital, where the former imperial treasurer's granddaughter now ran a small accounting firm, which seemed somehow appropriate. He told her what her grandfather had done and why. He told her that the documentation had been preserved and had been used. He did not minimize what the grandfather had also built, the system that had enabled the theft, but he told the whole truth of it, including the part where the old man had ultimately tried to undo the harm. She thanked him. She did not forgive the grandfather. That was not hers to give or withhold, but she thanked Cale for coming. For making the journey. For treating it as something that mattered. He walked out of her accounting firm into the provincial town's afternoon and stood in a street that was very ordinary and very far from empire and politics and legal coups, and he felt something shift in him that had been locked up for 6 years. Not happiness exactly, nothing so simple. More like the recognition that the world was large enough to contain the past and the future both. 3 months into the transition, the provisional governing structure held its first formal multi-body meeting, the Compact Council, as it had been named, drawing representatives from the noble houses, the church under Solvain's careful supervision, the military under Oren's newly instated advisory role, the legal commission under Lee's direction, and an elected civic chamber that was small and somewhat chaotic and exactly the kind of thing that made Fenn smile his real smile when it first convened. It was imperfect. It was deeply, earnestly imperfect. It was also, by the standards of the history Cale had spent 6 years reading, remarkable. Dane had, in an act that surprised nearly everyone including Cale, formally requested to be assigned as the Compact Council's liaison to the provincial territories, specifically the formerly border territories from which the tribute had been stolen. It was not a glamorous role. It required extensive travel, a great deal of listening, and the specific humility of someone arriving in communities that had been robbed by his father and asking them to believe in a new structure. He was good at it, in ways nobody had predicted, because Dane had spent his entire life performing composure and had never had the opportunity to practice genuine listening until now. Cale, for his part, took the position that Fenn had asked him to take months before he'd been ready to accept it. The Compact Council's formal historian and first archivist. Not a political position, not a power position, a position for someone whose specific combination of skills included knowing where the Empire's real records were, knowing how to read them, and knowing, from the archivist, how to preserve the truth of things regardless of what official narratives tried to do to them. He was, he discovered, extremely good at this. He was also, for the first time in 6 years, not looking over his shoulder. He wrote to the archivist. The letter took 3 weeks to compose and was, by his own assessment, not eloquent. He told them that Kelleran's family had been informed. He told them what had happened with the documents they'd provided. He told them, at the end, that the position of archivist, the independent keeper of testimonies and truths outside the official record, was something the new structure wanted to formalize rather than leave to informal tradition. That there would be a budget and a building and an institutional charter. And that the obvious first formal archivist, if they wanted the role, was the person who had been doing it independently for longer than anyone else alive. The archivist's response came back in 2 weeks. It was a single paragraph, in the archivist's precise, ink-stained handwriting. I will accept the charter on the condition that the institutional mandate specifies the archivist's independence from any governing body, including the Compact Council. The archivist serves the record. The record serves everyone. If this can be written into the charter with legal force, I will come out of the mountains. It has been a while since I've had a proper library. Cale forwarded the response to Lee. Lee wrote the provision in 12 minutes. There were setbacks. The transition was not smooth. Nothing the archivist's record suggested about history indicated it would be. 2 of the 12 noble signatories tried to use the power vacuum to expand their own territory, which required the Compact Council's first enforcement action, which was uncomfortable and necessary and handled with the minimum force Oren could arrange. 3 provincial governors openly refused to recognize the new structure and had to be replaced, which required process and patience that everyone resented having to apply. High Cleric Solvain's theological clarification produced a minor schism in the eastern provinces that would take years to fully resolve. The hardest moment came 4 months in, when a member of the Civic Chamber, a young representative from one of the border territories, stood up in a full Compact Council session and pointed out that the tribute money that had been stolen over a decade had never been accounted for in the transition documents. That it was simply gone, spent, that the communities from which it had been taken were still experiencing the material effects of a decade of extraction. And that legal dissolution of the authority that stole it was not the same thing as restoration. She was absolutely correct. Cale said so from the historian's seat, which was technically outside the vote floor. He said it clearly enough that it went into the official record. The resulting discussion lasted 6 hours and produced a formal commitment to a decade-long restoration fund, administered independently, with the border territories having direct representation in its management. It was imperfect as a financial mechanism. It was more than nothing, which was what they'd had before. The young representative from the border territories voted yes with the expression of someone who knows they've won the first round of a much longer argument. A year and a half after the Festival of Remembrance, Cale took a trip to the Eastern Mountains. Not to deliver anything, not as part of an operation. He brought Saris because she hadn't seen it, and Oren because Oren had said once that he wanted to see what Cale had described, and nobody took Oren's quiet expressions of interest lightly. They made the journey over a week and a half of travel, and arrived at the Cliff Library on a clear autumn morning to find the building looking slightly different, a new, carefully added extension, and a small official bronze plaque beside the door that read, "The Independent Archive." Formally chartered. The archivist opened the door before they'd knocked, which Cale had been expecting, and extended the information that there was tea ready, which he had not been expecting. The inside of the library was changing, not losing its characteristic organized chaos, but adapting to include a small official receiving area, a formally catalogued reference section where previously everything had lived in the archivist's head, and 2 young assistants who were being trained and who had the specific bright, slightly stunned expression of people who had discovered what their purpose was very early in their careers and were overwhelmed by it. They had tea. It was a genuinely unremarkable hour by most measures. Tea in a library in the eastern mountains with an extremely old person and 2 of your closest companions. The archivist asked precise, intelligent questions about the governance transition. Saris asked equally precise questions about the archive's cataloging system. Oren sat quietly and drank his tea and occasionally asked something simple that turned out to be the deepest question in the room. At one point the archivist looked at all 3 of them and said, with the same flat delivery they used for everything, "You did reasonably well." For a first attempt, coming from the archivist, this was a significant compliment. On the way back through the mountains, Saris walked beside Kale and they talked about the part of the plan none of them had articulated in those early meetings in the underground fighting ring and the safe house in Denvara. The part that wasn't legal dissolution or noble coalitions or archive extractions. The part that was simply, what do you do after you've spent 6 years being defined by what you're fighting against, and now you have to figure out what you're for? It was, they both admitted, a harder question. It was also a better problem to have. 2 years after the Festival of Remembrance, the first freely contested election for the Civic Chamber expanded from its original 12 seats to 45. The border territories had 8. The logistics of holding an election across 4 continents were extraordinary, and the whole thing was messy, and the result was a chamber that could barely agree on what to eat for lunch, which was, Fenn explained to anyone who would listen, exactly the point. A chamber that agrees on everything is a chamber that isn't representing enough different people. He put that in the founding document of the Civic Oversight Commission. It went in on the first try. Kale received a letter from his father 3 years into the exile. He almost didn't open it. He did open it. It was not an apology, he had not expected one, and the archivist's records of Valdros's entire history suggested the capacity for apology had been carefully excised from his personality somewhere around his 25th year of power. It was, instead, a series of questions about what Kale had done with certain specific documents. It was the letter of a man who still believed the relevant measure of anything was strategic value. Kale wrote back a single line. They're in the archive, available to any researcher who wishes to study them. He did not sign it with a title. He thought about his mother sometimes, especially when Duchess Holt referenced her, which she did occasionally, with the particular quality of someone keeping a person present through the act of remembering them aloud. She had died when Kale was 11. He'd known her long enough to understand who she was but not long enough to ask her the questions that only occurred to him later. Holt had told him, over a dinner 2 years into the transition, that his mother had once said, "The purpose of power is not to be held. It is to be used and then shaped into something that doesn't require you personally anymore." He'd written it down. It was in the archive. 5 years after the Festival of Remembrance, the Compact Council held its 100th formal session. It was not a particularly remarkable session by content, several provincial governance disputes, a trade agreement with a neighboring state, and 45 minutes of the Civic Chamber arguing about the wording of a resolution that ultimately changed 2 words in a document. But it was, in the aggregate, 100 instances of a structure that had not existed before, convening to address the business of governing 4 continents by means other than the absolute will of one person. The archivist attended as an observer and made several archival notes. The question Kale was asked most often, in the years after the festival, was whether he had wanted the throne. Whether the whole operation had been about power, ultimately, dressed up in legal justification. He had a few different answers depending on context. The true one, which he gave sparingly, was, "I wanted my father to be accountable. I wanted the people who had been robbed to have the theft acknowledged. I wanted the system to work in the way it claimed to work." Whether I was on a throne or not seemed like the least interesting part of the question. Most people found this unsatisfying. He found that finding it unsatisfying was their right. Saris built the accountability intelligence structure, and it was exactly as hard as she'd said it would be, and she was exactly as good at it as Kale had known she would be, and she found it every bit as necessary and frustrating and essential as work you're suited for always is. She hired people who'd spent time on both sides of the line she was trying to draw, because those were the people who understood what the line was for. Fenn joined formally as her deputy. They argued constantly about methodology and trusted each other's judgment implicitly. It worked, as a partnership, in the specific way that opposites working toward the same end always work. Oren Blackthorne took the formal advisory role in the military restructuring and held it for 4 years, at the end of which he submitted a detailed report on the structural changes made, a recommendation for his successor, and a letter of resignation. The letter was characteristically plain. "The job is done as well as I can do it. The next part requires someone who wants to build a career in this. I want to grow vegetables in the Rassel's Crossing territory and occasionally consult when someone does something obviously stupid." The Compact Council accepted the resignation with formal regret and occasional requests for consultation. Lee Elaron became the head of the Legal Commission and spent a decade doing the single most complex long-term legal project that had been undertaken in the Empire's history, retroactively reviewing, under the restored Compact framework, every major legal ruling made during Valdros's reign that had derived its authority from the illegitimate imperial power structure, and establishing which of those rulings could be upheld under proper authority, which needed revision, and which were simply void. It was, they told anyone who asked, the greatest puzzle they'd ever been given. They said this with the specific happiness of someone who genuinely means it. 7 years after the Festival of Remembrance, Cale Donvale went back to the exact spot on the muddy road where, one rainy night long ago, he stood looking at a distant city's lights and carrying nothing but a 6-year-old exile, an iron ring, and a plan. The spot was not particularly significant looking. It was a stretch of provincial road, now in slightly better repair than it had been. He stood there for a few minutes, in the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary day, and looked at nothing in particular, and went back to his work. The archivist, at some point that was never formally marked but became apparent retrospectively, had begun training their 2 young assistants not just in cataloging but in the philosophy of the position, the independence, the preservation, the service to the record rather than to any power. This had been happening quietly for years. One afternoon, the archivist informed the Compact Council liaison that they would be available for consultation but would be delegating primary archival functions over the next 2 years. They were not retiring, they were propagating, which was, they noted, rather more useful. The world that had existed before the Festival of Remembrance was not a good world. The world that existed after it was not a perfect one. It was a world where people who had been robbed received formal acknowledgement and partial restoration and representatives who argued on their behalf and a legal structure that could in principle be held accountable. Which is a different thing from a world where the robbing doesn't happen. It was a world that had to be maintained. That was the part nobody found romantic, but everybody who had ever lived through the alternative found essential. In the Independent Archive, on the day the Compact Council formally approved the Restoration Fund's final disbursement to the last border territory, 10 years after the Festival of Remembrance, a document was filed. It was a witness account of the legal transition, written by its principal historical participant, who had also served as the archive's first director. It was written plainly. It named every person involved by name and described their contribution honestly, including their failures and hesitations and moments of doubt. It was filed under History, Primary Source, Contemporary. It was, Lee noted upon reading it for certification purposes, the least self-aggrandizing first-person historical account they had ever processed. Cale did not write an ending to the witness account because, as he noted in its final paragraph, endings were a narrative convenience that history did not actually provide. What it provided were changes in direction, and periods of stability, and new complications arising from old solutions, and the ongoing, imperfect, necessary work of people trying to do better than what came before. This was not, he acknowledged, a satisfying conclusion. But it had the advantage of being true. He filed it, went home to his apartment in the Merchant District, 3 rooms, modest, full of books, and made himself dinner. The empire of Valdrath did not fall. It transformed, which is harder, and slower, and more contested at every step, and arguably more durable in the end. The transformation was not complete in any one person's lifetime, which was expected and frustrating and correct. What had been built, in those specific months between a rainy night on a provincial road and the morning a legal document was entered into council record, was not a perfect world. It was a changed direction. Sometimes that is exactly the thing that matters. Sometimes that is everything. And somewhere in the eastern mountains, an old archive sat in a cliff face with a bronze plaque beside its door. And inside it 2 young archivists catalogued everything, the successes and the failures, the heroes and their complications, the people who had said nothing and the people who had said the right thing too late and the people who had tried their honest best in circumstances that gave them very little room to work. All of it, preserved, because the truth of how things actually happened is the only thing that gives anyone a genuine chance of doing better. That was the job. That would always be the job.